From Confederation forward, the transition of the Church of England in British North America to the Anglican Church of Canada. At the conclusion of the third lecture in this series, The Unwieldy Nature of Church Administration, based solely in the colonial office and the person of the Archbishop of Canterbury, was noted as having become a demonstrable impediment to the church in the colonies. The disruptive developments involving Ridley and Duncan, Hills and Cridge, were in fact indicative of a larger pattern discernible as far afield as South Africa, Australia, India, and New Zealand. In this final lecture, we will explore the theological and political developments that contributed to the consolidation of the four provinces of Anglicanism in British North America and the confederation of these provinces into the General Synod of the Church of England in Canada, which ultimately became the Anglican Church of Canada in 1955. In doing so, we will also trace the emergence of the Anglican Communion from the time of the Colenso controversy of the 1860s to the stresses and strains that gave rise to the Virginia Report and the Windsor Report and their aftermath in the early decades of this present century. In 1867, the passage of the BNA Act marked the creation of Canada as a nation. It's reasonable, I believe, to recognize that in part, at least, the impetus behind this step was given forth by recent events south of the 49th parallel. It's a well-known fact that at the height of the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the Union had threatened to invade British North America in retaliation for Britain's continuing to trade in cotton with the states of the Confederacy. In the aftermath of the Civil War, with a well-equipped and yet to be demobilized army, it was no secret that the territorial expansion to the north was being considered by a faction within the newly triumphant and reunified United States of America. The need for a national definition that gave rise to Confederation also appears to have added force to the movement in the direction of ecclesial self-governance among the Protestant churches in Canada. Census results from this period demonstrate that while a significant part of the population of Canada, Anglicans at this point were by no means in the majority. According to the census of 1871, 40% of us were Roman Catholics. Of the remaining 60%, 17% were Methodists, 16% were Presbyterians, 7% were Baptists, and 14% were Anglicans. As noted previously, with reference to the frustration of the ambitions of Bishop Strawn in the Diocese of Toronto, establishment in the manner of the Church of England was a dream that was vanishing with the speed of an ice cube in a blast furnace. Anglicanism in Canada could not look to the civil authority for funding, while at the same time ongoing support from England was diminishing. The resources of the two principal missionary societies, the CMS and the SPG, were being spread ever more thinly as mission fields opened up in places like New Zealand, Africa, India, and the British cantonments in China. Also, Canadian bishops were finding, as had Bishop Hills in Columbia and Bishop Ridley in Caledonia, that some of the clergy sponsored by the missionary societies, particularly those of the CMS, were having difficulty accepting synodical governance and episcopal leadership. The dioceses of Toronto, Quebec, Montreal, and Huron agreed to form a provincial synod in 1861. Norman Knowles writes, and I quote, "The provincial synod was empowered to exercise ecclesiastical governance and discipline over both clergy and laity through the enactment of canons, to provide regulations for the appointment of bishops, priests, and deacons, and the creation of new dioceses, to promote the further consolidation and united action of the whole of the dioceses of British North America." The dioceses of Nova Scotia and Fredericton joined to form the Provincial Synod of Canada. Rather presumptuous. Canada is the Maritimes, according to them, in 1871. And the dioceses of the Prairies, originally the Diocese of Rupert's Land, Athabasca, and Saskatchewan, joined to form the province of Rupert's Land in 1875. Later on, in 1914, the General Synod of the Church of England in Canada created the ecclesiastical province of British Columbia and the Yukon. And that's interesting because it was held up for a long time because Caledonia would not join. I asked Archbishop Douglas Hambidge, who had been Bishop of Caledonia, why this was, because there is no record of why the delay happened. And he writes, "The loyalty of the early clergy, and probably even the Bishop of Caledonia, was rather to the CMS than to the Canadian Church. A similar attitude could be found in the UK, where parishes held very lightly to their association to bishop or diocese. To this day, some parishes are owned by a society, such as the Church Pastoral Aid Society, which has a strong voice in all appointments. It is not surprising that the CMS body like Caledonia would not have much enthusiasm for being part of a province. That may explain the reluctance. Douglas also went on to say that as bishop, he found that was still part of the fabric of the Diocese of Caledonia, even in his time. The closing decades of the 19th century saw a general drive toward national consolidation among the mainline Protestant churches of Canada. In 1875, the three main sects of Presbyterianism joined to become the Presbyterian Church of Canada. And by 1884, the disparate unions of Methodism had joined to become the Methodist Church in Canada. Preliminary discussions involving representatives from the three existing provinces of the Anglican Church in Canada and the dioceses of Columbia and New Westminster, which took place in Winnipeg in 1890, bore fruit in 1893 in the creation of the General Synod of the Church of England in Canada. The Solemn Declaration of 1893, which is a document most of us have read only in the middle of long and boring sermons, and then under duress, is probably one of the most important documents of the Anglican Church of Canada. And I'm going to go into it in a little detail here because I think it is something we all ought to have in our minds when we enter into dialogue with people of other denominations who ask who we are and what we are about. First, the document of 1893 defines us as a synodical church. It states that the action it is taking in forming the Canadian Anglican Church is the work of, in quotes, the bishops, together with the delegates from the clergy and laity of the Church of England in the Dominion of Canada. This represents a marked departure from the form and practice of ecclesiastical governance as it was then known in the Church of England, where the laity were not represented and where the voice of the clergy, not in episcopal orders, was of marginal significance. It also says that what follows is the action of the Church of England in Canada, with no reference to legislative establishment by secular authority, federal or provincial. The Anglican Church of Canada, in common with all of the provinces of the Anglican Communion, except England, is not and never has been an established church. That is, it was not established and supported by secular leadership process of land, whether the crown or democratically elected legislatures. Nor does the definition define the identity of the emerging Canadian Church solely in reference to either the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Church of England. Instead, it states that the Canadian Church is in full communion with the Church of England throughout the world as an integral portion of the one body of Christ. By defining itself as being in communion with a worldwide Anglicanism, the Canadian Church effectively claimed and reinforced the principles of provincial autonomy, diffused authority, and what the writers of the Virginia Report have referred to as subsidiarity, the freedom to make decisions related to local ministry and practice at the level closest to the communities which will be affected. Secondly, the Declaration defines the Canadian Church as a creedal rather than a confessional church, and defines the Church's understanding of the role of Scripture. It affirms that the Canadian Church receives, in inverted commas, the one faith revealed in Holy Writ as defined by the creeds, and, again in quotes, the same canonical scriptures of the Old and New Testaments as containing all things necessary to salvation. The teaching, sacraments, and orders of the Church of England are similarly received and affirmed. In so doing, the Declaration continues in the Anglican tradition of being a creedal church as distinct from Protestant confessionalism. The biblical source of our faith and practice is affirmed inasmuch as it pertains to things necessary to salvation. But it is worth noting that there is no claim made for biblical inerrancy or literalism. Members of the Church, defined by this declaration, retain the right, and one might say even the obligation, to subject Holy Writ to the best critical scholarship available, and are not slavishly bound to a sola scriptura approach when dealing with what Richard Hooker and other Anglican theologians have described as things indifferent, in that they are not matters necessary to salvation. Thirdly, the Declaration defines the Canadian Church's approach to faith, order, and discipline. It claims for General Synod the authority to hold and maintain the doctrine, sacraments, and discipline of Christ, as the Lord hath commanded in his holy word, and as the Church of England hath received and set forth in the Book of Common Prayer, the Ordinal, and the 39 Articles. As H.R.S. Ryan, past Chancellor of the Anglican Province of Ontario, says in his book, Aspects of Constitutional History, which you might want to read some night when you are suffering from insomnia, with all due respect to Judge Ryan, he says of this, pledge was not to these documents themselves. The pledge was not to these documents themselves, but to the doctrine, sacraments, and discipline set out therein. The provision of the accompanying basis of constitution of the General Synod clearly indicated that the Canadian Church was assuming the power to review and revise those documents consistent with their essential elements. Chancellor Ryan goes on to state, in quote, there was no pledge of adherence to English ecclesiastical law, statutory, traditional, or canonical. The General Synod was expected to complete the canonical legislative needs of the Church throughout Canada in the areas of jurisdiction assigned to it. In other words, at a certain point, we have the authority to amend what we do at the local level. The Solemn Declaration of 1893 is therefore a crucial founding document of the Anglican Church of Canada, defining not merely matters internal to our practice of faith, order, and discipline, but also setting forth a clearly defining the terms by which we engage as a member province of the worldwide communion. These are of great significance in the manner in which we have dealt with recent questions of the solemnizing of same-sex marriages, as indeed they have also related to past controversies over remarriage of divorced persons and polygamy in the African provinces of the Communion, and with reference to the ordination of women to the priesthood and to the episcopate. The Declaration commits us to the maintenance not of an ossified code, but rather of a living tradition which our Church may from time to time enhance, amend, or correct in a manner consistent with our common understanding of the guidance and inspiration of the same Holy and Divine Spirit who is given to them that believe to God, given to them that believe to guide them into all truth. This process of definition was furthered in 1955 when our General Synod gave its approval to changing the official name of our church from the Church of England in Canada to the Anglican Church of Canada. This was in part, but only in part, the result of a desire to further distance our church from its colonial past. By the middle of the 20th century, we were no longer an ethnically English church. Depending upon where you looked in Canada, Anglican parishioners had come to represent a wide variety of ethnic and racial origins. The average parish list, for instance, in the Diocese of Edmonton, where I began my ministry, contained almost as many Polish, Czech, or Ukrainian names as it had names of those who might be supposed had come from the British Isles. A similar sample from some dioceses or some parishes in the Diocese of New Westminster could be seen to obtain a majority of surnames originating from southeast China or northern Japan. It could also be noted that the changing of the name of our church in 1955 was partly representative of the hopes of those who were anticipating a union with the United Church of Canada. This proposed plan of union was rejected by our church in 1975, largely because of concerns of both Anglo-Catholic and evangelical Anglicans over evidence that such an arrangement might lead, as it had so demonstrably done in the United Church since its creation in 1925, to a substantially unacceptable compromising of definitive theological and ecclesiological principles, chief among which were the elements of the Lambeth Quadrilateral of 1888, to which I will refer a bit later on in this lecture. In particular, union with the United Church of Canada would have required the removal, or at best, the substantive reduction of the role of the episcopate in the governance and discipline of our church as a result of the proposed plan of union. Now, the plan of union, rejected in 1975, was nevertheless not the whole story of Christian reunion as touching Anglicanism and the Anglican Church of Canada. In 3 instances, full communion with other branches of Christianity has been successfully established and maintained without going the step of structural union. From the time of the reign of Elizabeth I, clergy from the Eastern Orthodox churches have studied at Oxford and Cambridge, and from that time on, a relationship of full communion has existed between Anglicanism and the Eastern Orthodox churches. If you happen to be lucky enough to spend Easter in Greece, you are welcome to receive the sacrament in any of their churches, and they in ours. In 1931, the Bonn Agreement established a similar relationship between worldwide Anglicanism and the old Catholics of Europe. When the Anglican Church of Canada met as General Synod at Waterloo in the spring of 2001, it did so in concurrent session with the National Convention of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. At that time, both bodies endorsed the document titled Called to Full Communion, otherwise known as the Waterloo Declaration. This formal affirmation of a relationship of full communion between our two churches has its roots in the historical relationship which Anglicans and Lutherans have shared since the Reformations of the 16th century. It's a milestone in the renewal of ecumenism and stands as a unique interpretation and application of the Lambeth Quadrilateral as a formula for ecclesial reunion. A somewhat humorous anecdote. I was at General Synod 2001, and our previous bishop, Jim Cowan, was also there. Then he was to us, and executive archdeacon. And Jim told me that when he and the other delegate had gone with Archbishop Piers to tell the Lutherans that we had approved the Waterloo Declaration, and you had these big TV screens playing so that both bodies could see and hear each other. Unbeknownst to Jim or Michael Pierce, as they were announcing the good news on the floor of Synod where we were, the debate on changing the Canon to concur with the Canadian Charter of Rights was going on. And a rather obnoxious delegate from Fredericton had just got up and said loudly that if we pass this motion, it will allow a man to marry his daughter. At the same time, the Lutherans, hearing the news of the passage of the Waterloo Declaration, rose up and cheered. It was one of those moments that just defies description. In the second section, we'll deal with the Colenso controversy and the evolution of the Anglican Communion. The last half of the 19th century saw a number of intellectual and theological challenges to traditional Christianity. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. The school of thought generally referred to as higher criticism of theologians like Schleiermacher, Strauss, Feuerbach, and later the likes of Schweitzer and Boltzmann, was beginning to find its way into the thinking of liberal-minded clergy. I always like to remind people of two things here when I consider these gentlemen. One is Gilbert and Sullivan's line out of the Mikado, which refers to a particular fate of all prosy and dull society sinners who chatter and bleat and bore are sent to hear sermons from mystical Germans who preach from 9 till 4. And then I also remember the corruption of a certain Christmas carol that went around Trinity at the time. I was there as a student, which went, "Hark the herald angels sing, Boltzmann is the latest thing," or they would, if he had not demythologized the lot. The first of these radical challenges to the illusory calm of the Church of England came in the person of the Bishop of Natal, one John Colenso. Colenso, who was a cousin of William Colenso, who in the notes to my first lecture appears as having had the distinction of creating a language for the Maori, a written language for the Maori in New Zealand, and being their principal advocate at the Treaty of Waitangi. He was a cousin of John, and neither of them were people their bishops found easy to get along with. John Colenso, who was one of the bishops of Southern Africa, was a biblical scholar and a strong advocate on behalf of the Zulu. And he published a number of controversial articles, which, beginning in 1855, with his remarks on the proper treatment of polygamy, argued that current policy of requiring converts to abandon polygamy was doing substantial harm to the family structure of the original people of southern Africa. In subsequent articles, he also called into question the historicity and theological primacy of creation stories in Genesis and challenged the historical veracity of books like Joshua and the binding moral authority of Pauline letters like the Epistle to the Romans. The cat, to put it bluntly, was among the pigeons. The Council of Bishops in southern Africa tried Colenso for heresy, but that failed, largely because Colenso, like Cridge in our diocese, refused to acknowledge the authority of the court. In this case, the matter was appealed to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England in 1865, and that body further complicated matters by finding in favor of Colenso's contention that the matter was indeed ultra vires, that is, beyond the scope of the authority of the bishops of South Africa. The Privy Council decision did not, however, address the theological correctness of Bishop Colenso's recorded opinions. The ongoing controversy eventually gave rise to the first meeting of the body which called it itself the Lambeth Conference in 1867. Now here again, there is a Canadian connection. The first Lambeth Conference was convened as a response to concerns raised by the bishops of the province of Canada, that is all of us, rather than the Maritimers, who wrote to the Archbishop of Canterbury registering their alarm at the possibility that the recent judgment of the Privy Council, in quotes, should leave us governed by canons different from those in force in England and Ireland, and thus cause us to drift into the status of an independent branch of the Catholic Church. In response, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles Longley, invited all 144 bishops of the Anglican Church at home and abroad to meet at Lambeth in 1867. This was not universally attended. Of the 144 bishops invited, only 76 turned up, with significantly noted absences like the Archbishop of York and all his suffragans. There's a story there, but I couldn't quite get to the bottom of it. The result was a conference which, while it noted, inverted commas, the hurt done to the whole communion by the state of the Church in Natal, passed no definitive motion of censure against Bishop Colenso. This effectively set the jurisdictional role of the Lambeth Conference as being an advisory, but not a legislative or disciplinary body, comprised of all bishops deemed to be, in inverted commas, in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury. The conference of 1867 also marks the beginning of the Anglican Communion as a voluntary association of the independent provinces of the Anglican Church worldwide, the principal organ of which is now the Anglican Consultative Council. The 11th resolution of the Second Lambeth Conference, which met in 1888, gave further definition to its terms of membership in a statement that has become known as the Lambeth Quadrilateral. Now, this is of great significance and is worth quoting in full, so bear with me. It says that in the opinion of this conference, the following articles supply a basis on which approach may be made by God's blessing towards home reunion. 1. The Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments as containing all things necessary to salvation and as being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. 2. The Apostles' Creed as the baptismal symbol and the Nicene Creed as the sufficient statement of Christian faith. 3. The two sacraments ordained by Christ himself, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and of the elements ordained by him. 4. The historic episcopate, locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the various needs of the nations and peoples called of God into the unity of his church. End of quotes. This document, as no other, serves to define worldwide Anglicanism in our time. It is therefore, again, of great foundational significance to the Anglican Church of Canada. Now we move now to a third section of our lecture, and at this point I might suggest that you might turn off the video and get a cup of tea or something, because I have gone on a bit long, and we'll continue. Matters of order and discipline in modern times, specifically the remarriage of divorced persons, the ordination of women, the authorization of same-sex marriage, and the liturgical innovation and authorization of the Book of Alternative Services. The Anglican Church of Canada has, during the course of the 20th and the early 21st century, seen 4 significant moments of pastoral, liturgical, and theological revision. These revisions saw the provision for the solemnization of the marriage of divorced persons, the ordination of women to the priesthood and the episcopate, and the publication of the Book of Alternative Services and the blessing of same-sex unions. That's to put them in their chronological order. Now, to confuse things, I'm going to deal with the 3 disciplinary ones first, and then the VAS. The revision of the marriage canon was given second reading and approval by General Synod in 1967. The beginnings of this revision actually date back to a historical casualty of the English Counter-Reformation during the reign of Mary Tudor. There is clear documentary evidence that Archbishop Cranmer was intending to complete a revision of the canons of the Church of England, but that this massive undertaking was incomplete at the time of Edward VI's death in 1553. An integral part of this proposed canonical revision was provision for divorce and for the remarriage of, in inverted commas, the innocent party when a marriage failed and was dissolved. This was swept aside as Cranmer and his fellow reformers were deprived imprisoned, and subsequently martyred. When Mary died and Elizabeth became queen, this revision was overlooked and wound up as an archival oddity, only unearthed by recent historical scholarship, and this was by our good friend Diarmaid MacCulloch, to whom we owe this interesting piece of historical knowledge. As a result, the Church of England remained, as it still does today, as the only Protestant church that does not have a canonical provision for the remarriage of divorced persons whose previous spouses are still living. The provisions of the Canadian Canonical Revision of 1967 are predominantly pastoral. Once documentation establishing that a legal divorce has been ascertained, there is a requirement that the partners of the proposed new marriage enter into a discussion with their priest, through which provision for any children from the previous marriage is established, if necessary, and care is taken that inasmuch as can be the case, the causes of the failure of the previous marriage are resolved and not carried forward into the new marriage. In 1975, General Synod gave a second reading and approval to the ordination of women to the episcopate, or to the priesthood, and in 1986 gave approval to the ordination of women to the episcopate. The position of women in the Canadian Church, particularly with reference to the religious life and admission to holy orders, had been the subject of intense discussion and debate since the middle years of the 19th century. By early 1880s, women with religious vocation could join either the Sisterhood of St. John the Divine or the Sisters of the Church of England Deaconess and Missionary Training House was established in Toronto in 1890. This became the Anglican Women's Training College in 1947, and in 1969 was merged with the United Church's Covenant College to become the Center for Christian Studies. The significant contribution of women as catechists, particularly in the remote regions of Western Canada, was given recognition and formal identity with the foundation of the Bishops' Messengers of St. Faiths in 1928. Women were also able to serve as officers in the Church Army, an organization originally founded in England in 1882, and which commenced activity principally in the missionary dioceses of Canada in 1929. In the aftermath of discussions at the Lambeth Conference of 1968, the then Primate of Canada, Ted Scott, initiated a commission to study the question of women's ordination. After what Norman Knowles rather diplomatically refers to as a rancorous debate, our General Synod gave approval of the ordination of women to the priesthood in 1975. Now, I lived through much of that debate. Norman is discreet. A good deal of the negative side was not just rancorous, it was misogynist, and hateful. And the women who pioneered this transition in our church had to endure, quite frankly, unspeakable opposition. Women were ordained to the priesthood in the dioceses of Caribou, Huron, New Westminster, and Niagara on the 30th of November in 75. In 1994, Victoria Matthews was consecrated as a suffragan bishop of the Diocese of Toronto. It should be noted that this, as in matter of the remarriage of divorced persons, our church opted for a conscience clause. In the case of the amendment of the marriage canon, no priest who could not in conscience solemnize such a union was required to do so. The provision for the ordination of women to the priesthood was subject to approval by diocesan synods, and in the case of some dioceses, like our own here in British Columbia, this was more than a decade in coming. It's interesting now that we have not just women priests, but a woman bishop. Some things take time, but they do happen. In 2016, the General Synod gave first reading to an act to approve a right for the solemnizing of same-sex marriages. The second passage of this act failed at the General Synod of 2019. It passed in both houses of laity and clergy, but failed to receive the required two-thirds majority in the House of Bishops due, in my opinion, to the ecclesiastical gerrymandering indulged on the part of certain conservative dioceses who conveniently elected surplus suffragan bishops for that synod. The act failed by 2 votes in the House of Bishops. This notwithstanding, many of our bishops in our dioceses, on the strength of the fact that General Synod has not specifically forbidden the use of a right for the marriage of same-sex couples, have proceeded to authorize this practice in their dioceses. We remain in a state of process on this issue, and probably we will see, as the report of the Jurisdiction Task Force, which I chaired back in the turn of the last century, recommended, we will see and accept a Canadian patchwork until some sort of regular practice is worked out. None of these 3 changes came without a lengthy process of reflection, discussion, and consultation. In each case, there were those who predicted dire consequences, who threatened schism, and who did, especially in the case of the ordination of women and the blessing, solemnizing of same-sex unions, depart to form schismatic fellowships like the Anglican network. Our church was undoubtedly hurt by these divisions and departures, but again, in my opinion, we have nevertheless emerged from the conflict a stronger and more ethically integrous family of faith. Finally, in this section, in 1983, our General Synod gave its approval to the draft version of a book of alternative services. A revised copy of this was published for use in our church in 1985. This was prefaced by almost a decade and a half of experimental rites. following the General Synod's approval of the development of alternative liturgies. I served the early years of my priesthood during these years. And what I remember was the liturgical schizophrenia that possessed many parishes. The 8 a.m. celebration of most churches would be completely prayer book, a said Mass. The 11 o'clock, which was usually given over to the older section of the parish, would similarly be a sung Mass with hymns from the old Blue Book or hymns ancient and modern. But the 9:15, which was aimed at families, was either the Kootenai Rite or the Caribou Rite, with folksy hymns by people like Carrie Landry and company. The coming of a book which regularized all this was seen by many of us as something of a relief, particularly when that book was found to contain a more or less unchanged version of the old prayer book rite as well. I kind of betray my own prejudices here, but what I notice is that the BAS has become a standard feature in many of our parishes, but I notice a perceptible drift that is epitomized by our own parish in the direction of prayer book language suitably amended to have inclusive language, but otherwise faithful to that lovely old form that is still an Anglican standard and will continue to be so at least until I am gathered into the arms of Jesus. I want to close by bringing us back to the question of first contacts, and in doing so, to deal with the primate's apology to our Aboriginal members about the residential schools and the acceptance of that apology. I want to begin by reading you the words of Michael Pearce, our primate's apology offered to the native people who had gone to residential schools. He says, "I accept and confess before God and you our failures in the residential school. We failed you, we failed ourselves, we failed God. I am sorry, more than I can say, that we were part of a system which took you and your children from home and family. I am sorry, more than I can say, that we tried to remake you in our image, taking from you your language and the signs of your identity. I am sorry, more than I can say, that in our schools so many were abused physically, sexually, culturally, and emotionally. On behalf of the Anglican Church of Canada, I present our apology." These words are the heart of the formal apology offered by Michael Pearce, our primate, to the National Native Convocation which met at Minaki, Ontario, on August 7th, 1993. The apology marked a significant step toward the healing of the relationship between the Anglican Church of Canada and its Aboriginal members. The General Synod's reception of the Henry Report, titled Beyond Traplines, brought an end to our church's involvement in the residential school system in 1969. Our primate apology began a journey which has led our church to re-examine its relationship with Aboriginal Canadians. It has also led us through the dark night of litigation, ended by the grace of God in the agreement between our church and the Government of Canada in 2002. We came within literally hours of being dissolved. That's how close it was. But litigation and its costs are just about money. They were never about healing and reconciliation. After the primate issued our apology, there was a long period of mutual consideration, a period in which we, the church, had to listen in order to hear the pain we had caused. It was also during this period that a significant discussion occurred within the Aboriginal Anglican community, resulting in the formation of the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples, which appears in documents as the acronym ACIP. Their covenant, issued in 1994, reads as follows: under the guidance of God's Spirit, we agree to do all we can to call our people into unity in a new self-determining community within the Anglican Church of Canada. To this end, we extend the hand of partnership to all those who will help us build a truly Anglican Indigenous church in Canada. May God bless this new vision and give us grace to accomplish it. End of quotes. ACIP continues to play an important role in the life of our church, particularly at the national level. Since 2001, meetings of our General Synod have been blessed by the presence and participation of Aboriginal partners who bring the particular insights, concerns, and observations of First Nation Anglicans to the councils of our church. ACIP, in partnership with General Synod, initiated a search for a national Indigenous bishop in 2005. In 2007, Mark MacDonald was consecrated bishop and appointed to this ministry by the General Synod. Canon 22, established in the meeting of General Synod at Halifax in 2010, gave approval to the establishing of a new self-determining national Indigenous ministry within our church. This action also endorsed a statement of 5 principles as developed by ACIP, and these are: to speak for Indigenous Anglican people in the councils of the church, to interpret what the councils of the church are saying to Indigenous people, to be a spokesperson for Mother Earth, to act as a midwife for a self-determining Indigenous church, and to represent the authority of Indigenous identity within the Anglican Church of Canada. Bishop MacDonald, together with the Reverend Lydia Mamakwa, worked to establish the spiritual ministry of Mishamicoish, a new diocese in the Anglican Church of Canada. This was first approved by General Synod in 2013, and Lydia was installed as first bishop of this new diocese in June of 2014. This is a most significant step which we have yet to see the development of beyond its beginnings. It's quite different, and I think importantly different from what is being done in places like New Zealand, where, having had a similar kind of history with the Maori, the church there has gone to establish 3 completely independent jurisdictions. There you have what's called the Tikanga Maori, which is the Maori, the Tikanga Pakeha, which is for people of European origins, and the Tikanga Pacifica, which is for everybody else from the other Polynesian islands. Janet and I spent a good deal of time in New Zealand, and I had occasion to discuss this with several people who were in on the establishment of this relationship, almost all of whom speak of it with regret, because it has, in the words of one of them, resulted in a sort of low-level ecclesiastical apartheid. But that again is something that we have yet to wait and see how it will work out. I intend no criticism. I only mark that I think Canada is doing it better. It was my privilege to be present at General Synod 2001 when Bishop Gordon Beardy formally accepted our apology. I had been by that time listening to the stories of the school survivors and had been moved to share with them some of mine. Their pain had in some measure become mine, and mine theirs. We had found that peculiar and wondrous comfort which is only present when victims recognize and validate one another. We gathered that afternoon with an almost breathless sense of hopeful expectation that a new stage in our journey toward mutual healing was about to begin. We were not disappointed. Here are the words of Bishop Beardy's acceptance. They are, like Gordon, simple and unadorned, but eloquent and deep at the same time. They represent for us the gift that our Aboriginal brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ have given us, if only we are willing to walk beside them and to accept it for what it is. They have offered us a way of redemption from the pernicious sin of racism. Gordon said, "Before I say the dismissal, I would like to say to the primate, not as a bishop of the Anglican Church, but as an Anishinaabe who went to a residential school, from my heart, I would like to say that I forgive you, and I want to forgive your church, which has become my church. I forgive your people I forgive your people who have become my people. I accept your apology because you have worked so hard to break down the barriers. For things that were condemned before, today you receive them with joy. Where once we were outsiders, today we are with you as a friend, as a leader, as a brother. So I extend my hand. My children will hear what I said. My grandchildren will hear, for it is in forgiving that we can find peace, and it is in rebuilding that we will become strong again as nations. The Lord be with you. Let us depart in peace. And here we come back to my friend Julie Bird's original seminal question. What is it that makes the Anglican Church of Canada and Canadians indifferent so different? Perhaps it is that we are aware of ourselves as a community that is best defined as still being in process. Perhaps it is because, in the manner of healthy families, at our best, we are aware of having been welcomed as strangers in a strange land, and are formed by that awareness and are formed by that awareness into becoming a welcoming and inclusive, extending circle of community. In the end, it comes back to the unnamed lady of Peguis and all my relations. Amen.